So, hey everybody, I'm Lally Lloyd and I'm the director of All Our Children. Welcome to this month's webinar. We're really glad to have you with us. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education justice by supporting congregations and their leaders and their members who are exploring and forming and leading community partnerships with their local public schools and with programs that work for education equity. And we do this because far too many children, many of them children in poverty and many of them children of color, receive a substandard education. And we know that this is not God's dream. And we believe that Jesus equipped the church and calls us as church to serve our communities, serve our children, and challenge injustice. To learn more about us and our growing library of resources, check us out at allourchildren.org, and where you can also sign up for our newsletter, which is always the best way to keep track of what we're up to. Today's topic is on our I don't have it in front of me. We're going to be talking about the theological resources. There it is, Ben, standing on holy ground, the spiritual and theological resources for working for education equity. Thank you, Ben. And at the end of our session today, we'll come away with an understanding of some diverse ways that we as Christians are working for education equity and how we are nourished in our different traditions by prayer, by scripture, by Christian fellowship and community. We're going to share our own personal examples of faith practices that refresh us and keep us from being burned out. And we'll get some insight into the gospel call for justice and how that relates to education and equity. This session is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live, and so you'll be able to view it and share it widely after it's over, in fact, immediately after our session. And we'll send you a direct link to the recording along with any other resources that are mentioned during our call today within about a week. We do want to hear from you during the panel discussion, and we'll be using the chat feature of Zoom to do that. And I'm going to turn to Mary Liz Murray, All Our Children's Director of Communication and Programming, to describe how that tools work. So over to you, Mary Liz.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Excuse me. To use the chat, you're just going to scroll over the window that you're using to see this conversation, and you'll see a little chat bubble in the bottom menu there. If you click that open, the chat will open right up, and I've just put a message in there asking you all to introduce yourselves, let us know your name, where you're tuning in from. This is a good place to add to the conversation if you have thoughts or anything you want to share on what the panelists are talking about. It's also the place to ask questions. So if you have any questions as we're going through our conversations, whether they're general questions on the topic or a specific question to one of our panelists, feel free to type it in here, and I will be keeping a list, and we'll have an open Q&A section that I'll moderate toward the end of the session. So your chat bubble is at the bottom of your menu. Click that open and choose all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your questions and your thoughts on the conversation.
Thanks, Mary Liz. Our panelists today are Nicole Baker-Fulghum, President of the Expectations Project, the Reverend Ben Campbell, advocate and founding team member of the Micah Initiative in Richmond, Virginia, and of All Our Children, and the Reverend Amy Slaughter-Myers, the Associate Rector from Epiphany Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Thanks to each of you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm going to invite you each to introduce yourself a little bit more fully. Why don't you say a little bit about like where you are physically located right now today, a couple of words about your organization and how you describe yourself, your Christian affiliation, like what flavor of Christian are you? Let's just do that as our introduction, and then we'll go around again with another question that I'll give you. So to you first, Nicole.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much to Lally and Mary Liz and the team at All Our Children. We're very happy to get invited to talk about this, and hello to everyone. My name is Nicole Baker-Fulghum. So I lead an organization called the Expectations Project, and our mission is to equip, engage, and support faith-motivated public school advocates. So we focus heavily on engaging faith-based communities to become advocates for public policies and systemic change to help improve low-income schools and eliminate education equity. As you might imagine, Lally and I are very good friends. Our organizations partner all the time and try to learn as much as we can from each other. Today, I'm typically based in the DC area. Today, I am broadcasting live from my parents' home. My brother's childhood bedroom is where I sit right now. So welcome, as I said earlier, to my colleagues, to the 80s wallpaper behind you. And in terms of my faith tradition, I feel like I've been a part of almost every denomination. I grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which gave me a lot of roots in advocacy. The Black church has such a strong tradition in that. I went to a Church of God in Christ and a Foursquare church when I was in college and grad school, respectively. When I moved back to DC, I have gone to basically non-denominational congregations that are fairly racially diverse. So I would probably say right now I'm somewhere in the born again, progressive, evangelical, Black church, liberation theology. Like it's kind of a hodgepodge. So that's me.
Thank you for that. Ben, to you next, please.
Hello, I'm an Episcopal priest. My grandfather was a Moravian bishop, and I've been through a lot of different churches in my life, including the Church of 12 Step and Catholic Charismatic Benedictines. And for the last 28 years, I've been involved. I helped to start an ecumenical Christian monastery in Richmond, which is everything, and took on racial equity as a fundamental beginning. One of our leading African-American founders said, in Richmond, things are either black or white, and we need to try to find some way of doing both at the foundation of things. And so we have consistently worked at that. Can't remember my other questions, but anyway, I've been involved with education since my childhood, and not just going, but my mother was on the school board when I was 8, so that started it. And in Richmond, I helped to start the MICA initiative, which now has about 120 congregations working with 25 elementary schools in the inner city. And I've also been involved with a leadership program in a freshman academy at Armstrong High School, which is maybe the first African-American public high school in the South. We're not sure, right after the recent unpleasantness. And but I work with the freshman academy there, and I've been doing that on an experimental basis with mostly African-American Baptist clergy for the last 3.5 years.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Amy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Slaughter-Myers. I am an Episcopal priest. I serve in Baltimore County, Maryland, which is just a couple of miles outside of Baltimore City. It's a white flight congregation, predominantly white, that has spent significant time thinking about how to deal with that portion of its past. Its justice work has been in affordable housing, and it's been through affordable housing that it has begun to commit more to public school partnerships. So it's an interesting evolution. I've only been here 2 years, so I'm still very glad to be learning all the roots of the commitments here. And I am a lifelong Episcopalian and a daughter and graduate and niece and cousin of public school teachers. So this is an issue that has been in my life and in my passion for justice throughout my whole ministry life, even before I was a priest.
Mm-hmm. So, Amy, staying with you, what was a formative experience in your life as a Christian that made you realize it was important for you to be doing this education equity work?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I went to public schools, and I came from a family that was in a lot of upheaval. And I saw my own experience in education as providing me with tools for freedom and tools for living. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, but I would say I didn't own my faith as a Christian until I was in my 20s. And that's when I met and knew the freedom of the emancipatory God. So when I say that, public education gave me the tools to break free of the upheaval in my personal life as a kid, that met with such force and harmony with, God's dream for all of us as one of freedom and emancipation and liberation. And so it's really out of that that this issue is really important to me.
Mm-hmm. Nicole, how would you answer that question? What was a formative experience in your life as a Christian that made you realize it was important to you to do this work?
I think it would go back to my experiences growing up in an African-American church and seeing just the real power and influence that our church had on justice issues. So we, certainly learned all about our faith and what it means to be a Christian, but there was definitely an emphasis on living that out. And because of that influence, we had pastors that would, not only allow, the politicians who were, coming to kind of glad hand in the congregation to hopefully get folks' votes, he would let them do that, but he would also then have them come back a year later, 6 months later, and ask them, like in front of the congregation, so you promised this, how's that going? We need this, we need that, and had no problem holding people accountable. So that, I would say, was the first piece. And then secondly, just growing up as a kid in Detroit and a product of a Detroit public high school, like it was very clear to me what I didn't have, or what our schools didn't have compared to my friends in the suburbs, who were mostly white, and most of us in Detroit were Black. And it wasn't even a question of equity. And so seeing that and knowing that I still had two parents who had both gone to college, there were advantages that I had because of that, that even my friends in my neighborhood, some of them didn't have all that same kind of insider knowledge. And so all of those things combined to make me want to go and teach after I finished my bachelor's degree, to go teach in Compton, California, to teach kids who were just as smart as, anyone in the suburb was, but who had just been further behind for a variety of reasons. So those were sort of the things for me that transitioned me to that place.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, how about you? How would you answer that question?
My educational history is kind of strange. I was in Arlington. I went to St. Albans School in Washington through about the 7th grade. My twin brother, meanwhile, was in public school, and I was very jealous, as twins always are. And so I got to go out to public school in Arlington, the 8th grade, and because it gave me a sense of community. I now know that actually St. Albans was very abusive, and that as a young boy, I was pretty well mauled in that situation, although educated, I guess, in my head. But I wanted to be in the community, and public education put me in the community. Then my mother was first woman elected to a school board in Virginia, and was the chair of the school board at Brown versus Board of Education. And so they announced the integration of Arlington's public schools without court suit, and the General Assembly abolished the school board. And my father then took one of the cases that broke down Virginia's massive resistance. So we were living educational issues in my whole childhood. And it became clear to us that, I didn't know the word equity, but in my life it was about race, because everything in Virginia was about race, and everything in Arlington and Washington was about race. And so I think I just and I was going to church at the same time. And I think that that the gospel message along with the hypocrisy of the life that I was living as a white person in Virginia, just kept going after me, and still does. And living in Richmond, of course, and dealing with a extremely segregated system, both economically and racially, has just continued to grow that awareness.
Mm-hmm. So, Ben, staying with you, what spiritual practices do you find to be nourishing for you, and help you sustain this work? Because this is work for the long haul. So, what? Well, these are personal questions. So that's what we're after here.
We started Richmond Hill as an ecumenical community, a residential community with prayer 3 times a day, actually as a way of giving persons engaged in the community a way to have a spiritual base. A lot of us were pretty well burnt out, and I was in the bottle as well as being burnt out, and it was a pretty basic piece of work. So working at both personal quiet and regular intercessory prayer. I think, I love the spiritual. My mama prayed for me, had me on her mind, took the time to pray for me. I'm so glad she prayed. That's who we are. I mean, that's who we are today, doing what we're doing. And a lot, God is praying. God prays. So when we get into prayer, we basically get into the life of God, which has long-term intentions and deep intentions for every human being and for the entire society. And you cannot do this work without both personal attention to your own spirit, and also without. I do want to say about prayer. I was thinking about this, Lally. The thing about prayer for us is, when I go to the board meeting of the Armstrong Freshman Academy, which includes God knows what diversity of people, that group of people is always driven to prayer because of what it is we're looking at, listening to, working with. It's really interesting. And that experience of prayer with people who are driven to prayer, as opposed to a kind of a nice optional deal, is the thing that is so important in the kind of work that we do.
Ben, I want a little clarification here. I think what you're describing is going to a board meeting. I know that the Armstrong Freshman Academy is a public school program right there in the same neighborhood as Richmond Hill. And so you're there at a board meeting with people from across the community, across different religious traditions. And are you saying that as a group they pray together?
Yep.
Oh.
Well,
I don't think that would happen in Massachusetts.
Be in the Black community in the South, I'll tell you, because they just don't care. And, they pray at principals meetings, they pray at, we've been praying a lot. But folks, they just not embarrassed about it. And, if the African-American community where we are, families are Muslim and Christian as well, they pray together. It's a pretty basic, but this kind of prayer is a prayer that doesn't seek denominational or religious definition. It's the outcry of the heart to God for the children and people that we're living and working with. And we're all there because of that. And everybody who stays in that environment and functions in any positive fashion has to be rooted in some form of prayer.
And that's exactly why we wanted to have this conversation and invited each of the three of you, because what we know from our wider conversations within All Our Children is that folks are looking for support and looking for encouragement and looking for this kind of practice. Nicole, what kind of spiritual practices nourish and sustain you? And spiritual can be, it's a wide definition.
Yep, no, this is great. I think one of the things that I wrestle with, honestly, is coming from the organizations I worked in before, even as a teacher and in education policy, where we're just taught to be so outcomes focused and, find the goal, go after it, relentless pursuit of results, right? Those are all those traits that I think you know, for many of us, especially in areas like DC, my gosh, like we're just programmed that way, like very type A. And prayer was always a part of what I did, especially when I was a teacher, right? Like I literally would not have been able to be in any way, shape, or form a quality teacher. I had people that prayed with me, teachers in the school, similar to what Ben said. It was a predominantly African-American school community. We prayed all the time, right? Mm. So it was just very natural from a cultural standpoint, I think, as well as religious. But when I left that environment and worked in kind of the DC scene, it wasn't the norm. And so having run this organization for the last, I guess, almost 6 years now, that was a struggle for me to come back to that, because I've been so used to like, and if I like, you know, make a good strategic plan and like get a good quantifiable goal, like we can make it happen. And God always reminds you like, that's actually not really going to be the case for you. So for me, it has been that constant tussle of, right. So, you know, God gave us a brain, you know, went to some great schools, you know, so I got a good education, but ultimately all of this work is bigger than him. And I'm fortunate to have people on our team that I work with, and then just personal mentors who constantly call me back to that, who will remind me like, yeah, you're stressed about, you know, these, like all these things you see happening in public education that, you know, you really believe need to change. And it doesn't mean you don't still go after them with 110%, but at the same time, like you're only going to be able to do so much. And how do you right size your opinion about what you think should happen and when it's going to happen, with remembering that God is ultimately greater than this. And he doesn't like the suffering. He doesn't like the injustice, but sort of hearkening back to that. So that's kind of just the constant tension that I feel like I live in. On a practical level, our team has monthly prayer, our organization, which has been good for all of us, I think. Personal and professional are all welcome in that space in terms of prayer requests and topics and devotionals. We try to really push ourselves when we're doing policy work to think about, and what's the call to prayer about this particular issue, right? And so it doesn't just stay at the very like wonky place that I think a lot of us love. What's the call to prayer? And the last few things I would say, for me personally, I find reading fiction, which is not directly sort of, you know, Christian at all, actually. There's something about, even in this political season for me, which has been, I think, for a lot of people in our country, really challenging, just getting completely disconnected from the work itself and finding an incredibly well-written, beautiful novel that I can just escape into is actually very, very refreshing for me. And then the very last thing I'll say is I believe in personal retreat, and whether it's a silent retreat or you know, however you want to define that. And to the point that I've done them, and I've actually made it basically mandatory for everyone on our team to do one that our organization pays for, because we believe like you have to get that time and that self-care and that rest. And this work is hard. And so we build it in, and our chief of staff is bugging people right now. Like, have you scheduled yours? Like, you have to take it. We don't care really what you do. You just need to go somewhere and take some time. So that's the other practice that for me is just incredibly important for this work.
Thank you. Amy.
Oh gosh, I appreciate so much, Nicole, what you just said. And of course, Ben, what you just said too, both of those deep commitments and comments about what it is to do this work consistently just really resonates with me. I mean, I think a lot about Walter Brueggemann, who has a book called Sabbath as Resistance. And I try to keep that focus in my day. So when I take that time for Sabbath, that is also a mark of the resistance to the system that would have us be exhausting ourselves and working ourselves to the bone, even if it's for the cause of justice. And I have this practice, which is kind of, you know, it's like a mini Sabbath. Some days it might be like a micro Sabbath, but those intentionally taking those moments where noticing the space has opened up in my day, and if it's 5 minutes or whatever it is, to have some timelessness, sense of gratitude and peace, the peace of God that passes all understanding, and to be in that moment, that Sabbath moment, even in the midst of what else is going on. That's just a kind of practical thing that I try to focus on during the day. And of course, going on retreat when I can annually is really important too.
Mm-hmm. I think what I would add for to all the things that you all have said is an experience that I've had so often in my leadership position here in All Our Children, where I work from my office, and and so my work it's all virtual, with the exception of our local school partnership, where I go and spend Tuesday mornings during the academic year. But the number of times when I have gotten deeply troubled by a leadership challenge that I face, and I get all tied up in knots in some combination of emotion and spirit, and to practice being kind to myself in that moment. And sometimes that means going outside. I live on Cape Cod, where it's beautiful all year round. Even when the weather's terrible, it's beautiful. And sometimes sometimes in order to do better work, I have to step away. And maybe that's a little micro retreat along the lines of what Amy is saying. But I think of it in terms of just being kind to myself. You know, if somebody I loved was feeling the way I'm feeling at that moment, I would probably say, go take a walk. And it's not surprising, and yet it always is surprising how many times in that moment something shifts in me, and I get a point of clarity around the particular thing that I was struggling with. So this is spiritual work that we are doing. I think when we align ourselves with the God of justice and the community of the God of justice in this place, we are coming up against forces that are spiritual forces in the world, and it's a spiritual struggle. And it helps us to. I think it's important to remember that, and that can sometimes explain this feeling of stuckness, or the friction is too high, or the thing just isn't working, or it's not going, or whatever. So I just wanted to add that to all the other resources that you all had said. Thank you for that. So I want to ask you, when people want to talk to other folks at their churches, so if you were giving advice to people about, in addition to these personal practices that we've just been talking about what resources you would advise, point them towards. Are there sources of prayer, or are there particular scripture passages? Are there teachers either living or gone before us, who've written or spoken or sung messages that you find yourself turning to? Are there videos or lectures or those kinds of material resources that you draw on? And Amy, why don't we stick with you and see if you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, I mean, I when I think about that question, I think about the context that I'm in particular. And so I've worked with Episcopal congregations who have a strong Episcopal identity. So what I like to do is make use of our Episcopal resources in that sense, because it can work through folks who are very attached to their particular tradition in the context that I'm in. And I was thinking about something I've used a lot. It's just a short piece, and maybe you all are, surely you all are familiar with it, but Samuel Wells, who's an Episcopal priest, wrote a piece called Rethinking Service maybe 5 years ago. I know he has a book that he's expanded on that that's out this year. I have not read it, but it's like 6 or 8 pages, and it focuses on that the most important word in the Bible is with. Mm-hmm. We want as Christians to think that the most important word in the Bible is for. So we want to always do for, because Jesus died for us, this kind of thing. And he does it in a very sort of gentle kind of, I would say, Anglican way, in the sense of being very middle ground and using, looking at film and looking at poetry. And that really eats on people when you start to think about the most important word in the Bible being with, and what that means as a people who are doing justice work. It just dismantling this whole notion of four is something that has been really fruitful for the context that I have been in.
That's great. Thank you. Nicole, what do you point people towards?
Yeah, so I did a retreat, I guess it was last year, at a Jesuit retreat center. And I've always had a fondness for the Jesuits, just given their connection to social justice. And so as you might imagine, there were lots of really good sort of contemplative, meditative resources there. And I had read a little bit of Richard Rohr previously, but they had a whole section in their library. I sort of had all of his work, and it was highlighted. And so I spent a fair amount of time reading his work and found it to be very rest-inducing for me. And I, having grown up in sort of, I mentioned earlier, kind of a bit of evangelicalism, born again, Church of God in Christ, that whole, like the idea of meditation was, in my 20s was not something, it was like the Eastern stuff, like, you can't do that if you're born again. I have different, and I'm not, no shade if anyone feels that way. It was just what I was taught, but I've also realized that there's such truth and importance in meditation and being quiet and trying to really quiet my soul, which is my spirit, my mind, is incredibly hard for me to do. And I know when it's constantly going at like, a million miles an hour, I don't get the rest that I need. And so even just, I'm a fan of some of the apps. It's probably counterintuitive. You probably shouldn't like meditate with like your iPhone, but like whatever. There's a couple of apps like the Calm app and things that have just been really helpful for me to just learn to like breathe and try and just, I know it's an overused phrase, but just try to be present where I am and like really just be right there instead of like worrying about the next thing and the next thing. So that is all kind of in the same genre for me anyway, of the quiet retreat, which was like a 3-day quiet retreat, silent retreat at the Jesuit Center, which was really hard. But everyone was quiet, so there was no one to talk to. And my cell phone did not have a signal actually at the retreat center. I think it was intentional. So those are some things for me that have been helpful as honestly, I think I'm learning a lot more about how to get the rest I need and kind of embarking on new traditions and melding them with things that I've been taught for years and seeing how they actually really do have a pretty good connecting point.
Thank you. Ben, what spiritual resources do you share with people who are looking for advice?
I love what both Amy and Nicole said. Amy, I'm very much where I live in Richmond on the James River, and the same time Virginia was being founded in a very racist and unjust way. The King James translation of the Bible was occurring. It's the same period, 1611, 1607. I've been fascinated by this language that occurs in the New Testament when Jesus has gone off by himself to be quiet on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and people come over the rocks clamoring after him, and you're familiar with that. And it says in the King James Version, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and that follows the feeding of the 5,000. But how you can translate a word that is about feeling with to be feeling on. Compassion is with, suffering with, feeling is that is a cultural translation. It's a hierarchical culture making a translation of a Greek word into something other than what's occurring here. And similarly, of course, we do the feeding of the 5,000 in the same fashion. I think it's basically, I believe, the bag lunch theory of the feeding of the 5,000. And if you don't know what it is, email me and I'll tell you. I love it. We have a theological issue, which is that God so loved the world that he gave his son, not so loved the church. And the church wants to be primary, and church is always only true when it's secondary. So it is about the transformation of society and the coming of the kingdom that we talk. And within that context, we have to learn not just from scripture and theology, we have to be educated about the state of our society and our community. So our values, be they scriptural, which is basically Jesus is the ultimate acceptor of every human being. It is equity from the beginning. And Jesus is the edifier. That is, his goal is the growth and transformation of us as individuals, as well as the creation of an equitable society. Within that context, knowing about what's going on in the community, how we shape the community and how we build it is just as important as knowing what St. Paul's theory might be in 1 Corinthians. And it is always a dialogue and never just the one. We are not interested in giving people passwords to the kingdom of heaven after they die. We're interested in using our theology, our prayer, and our worship as a lens to enable God to make us effective servants within this community. Given that engagement in public education is one of the critical ways that we've been given within this culture to do this work. And so I'm a Virginian, that means I got lots of history. And, my great-great-great-grandfather was the first superintendent of schools in Rockbridge County in Lexington, Virginia. I don't think he went to that little restaurant, but he and actually was appointed to that position by Robert E. Lee, who at that point was president of Washington Lee University. And it was church people in Virginia in separate Black and white communities who built these public schools to include and give opportunity to every single human being. It's our democratic foundations are often more Christian than our churches are.
So Ben, I want to stick with you a little bit and see if we can go a little deeper into this connection between Scripture and the teachings and the life of and witness of Jesus of Nazareth and this education equity work. So I guess the question is for one of the pushbacks that we get sometimes is that when we're talking about education equity, we're talking about political work, and that somehow there are church people who think that that's not the business of church. Now, we've just already heard this afternoon Nicole's very powerful witness of what it meant to be formed in a Christian community that totally felt that the local politics, which is the welfare of the community, is indeed the work of the church. But some Christians don't see it that way, and I wonder if you can say some more, Ben, about this call between this biblical call for justice and the practice of education equity work. I mean, how I'm trying to help the four of us make this explicit. We all do what we do because we've internalized it and it's just obvious for us. But like when you're confronted with somebody who's never thought about these two things together, how do you make that connection?
It's always the question, Lally, and I have this feeling of standing in a room or a lecture hall or in a pulpit and saying something like this and watching 25% of the people open their eyes and say, that sounds right to me, and having another 50% of the people kind of go to sleep. So it's a challenging question. I will say that the people I work with right now in this movement within Richmond, a lot of them are conservative evangelicals who've somebody has been telling them that God's interested in the community and not just in church. It's a neat movement that's there, and it's generational. These are the children of the folks who didn't think that. I think that what happens is that people kind of cross the line. What I say to people is, you do not need to leave politics to the politicians. You do not need to leave government to the politicians. Your responsibility is for the community as a whole, and you need to hold that up to whoever gets elected. And I say that Jesus's primary teaching, Jesus's primary social teaching, really occurs in the parable of, in the story of the little child, who he put him in the middle of the room, and he said to the disciples, "Deal with it." Basically, you cannot ignore this reality. When I was growing up in Washington metro area, with lots and lots of friends who were in politics and government from all over the country, and I think probably coming out of the Second World War's chastening effect on the entire nation, there was a sense that purpose and method were separate questions. And so the question of a good public education system was one that we were able to promote and work with across party lines. And it was not seen as a partisan issue. The partisan issues might have been how you funded it, how you did some of the details of it. But the sense that there was a separation between goal and party, between concern and partisanship, was really built into the society. One of the crises of our present time in this larger community is this phony politicization of everything, which if we want an example, we've seen this thing with the children separated from moms on the border. You know, that's a concern. The politicization of it is a secondary issue. And I think, you know, that's what Jesus was doing with that child in the middle of the room.
So, Nicole, I've had the privilege of participating in the Faith and Equity Coalition that you and your organization have assembled, and through that, I've met a number of Christian leaders from different denominations, different traditions, including you know, people who would identify as progressive evangelicals and other wonderful groups like that. And I know that through your Hope for Students campaign, you recently delivered a whole stack of signatures to Secretary Betsy DeVos. So that was an actual example of, you know, of putting these two things together. Would you share that story with us?
Sure, happy to. So Secretary DeVos is the education secretary, and she and her administration have been mulling over what to do with some guidance that the previous administration, the Obama administration, had given to really try and help support kids of color, particularly Black and brown kids, who were getting suspended at significantly higher rates than white students, often suspended from schools and expelled from schools for the same infraction. So a Black student will get expelled, a white student will get a warning. The disparities are incredibly severe. It's happening all around the country in drastic rates. And so for us, we see that as an issue of ultimately institutional racism and racial injustice. And Secretary DeVos did an interview on 60 Minutes where she took a different perspective and said explicitly that she believed that was those were individual instances and not systemic. We strongly disagree. And as a Christian who shares, I think, a lot of the sort of foundational faith beliefs that Secretary DeVos shares, we wrote an open letter to her, which we sent out through our network, saying exactly what I said, that as Christians, we believe that God wants to protect all of his kids, especially those from historically marginalized communities. And what is our responsibility to ensure that we have a school system that adjudicates those matters in a fair way and helps to root out unconscious bias within teachers, within districts, and institutional racism in general. So we got about just over 25,000 people sign that open letter. I think has I don't know, 800,000 views of the brief video that we made, which is exciting and sad, right? Because I think it tapped into something that people know is still happening. This question of whether or not racism still exists in public schools. Like, it's sort of rhetorical, in my opinion, rhetorical question. And so as a result of that, it got some media attention, which is what we're supposed to do, right? Not for media's sake, but to get the attention of our elected officials, we need to like speak our voice. And to get 25,000 people who were willing to sign that, got their attention. We were invited to a meeting with other education advocates, and we shared our position. And because I have a great communication staff, they had a stack of all the names of the 25,000 plus people who signed that, which I got a chance to give to the secretary, you know, respectfully saying, this is not just Nicole Baker Fulgham's opinion. This is supported by 25,000 other people in the good old US of A that believe that we want your administration to look at this differently. They're going to make the decision with probably, honestly, any day now in the next couple of weeks. And regardless of what happens at the federal level, there is still work to be done at the state and local level in ways that we can all advocate for what's happening for fair discipline policies at the school level and the state level, and making sure we hold ourselves and our leaders accountable. So our voice matters. And that for me was another reminder of actually signing an open letter, sending an email, making a phone call to your elected official. They keep track of that. And that's part of our responsibility, we believe, as people of faith and Christians, to speak truth to power.
Do you find yourself, Nicole, getting some pushback from Christians who somehow think that I have a hard time even like articulating it because I don't see things the same way that they do, but I get pushback because people think that we're being political. And I want to say, well, we all are political because politics is how we navigate our differences and negotiate our differences, but we don't have to be partisan about it. And that's just my frame, how I address it. But what kind of pushback do you get, and how do you address it?
You know, we have gotten pushback. There are people who just don't believe that Christians should be speaking into these things. We just have a very different perspective. You can look at numerous Old Testament, New Testament scriptures where God doesn't just talk about sort of heart issues, but he talks about real systemic injustice that's happening to widows and orphans. And there's a reason why the year of Jubilee every 7 years, debts were, canceled out because the system was so overwhelming that God knew that could never, people would never make their way out of debt. So we really do hearken back to those scriptures. There are lots of people of faith who have been doing advocacy work for years, right? And so we hearken, stand on the shoulders of those giants and sort of reckon back to that for our work. The other thing that that I've gotten pushback on is that people have said, well, gosh, as Christians, like, we're supposed to be nice, and like having an open letter to naming Education Secretary DeVos and saying, like, we disagree with you. I've been told by some people that they didn't feel like that was nice, and that Christians, it's like, Amy, like, what? Wow. That Christians shouldn't, especially to another Christian, right? Because she leads with her faith, to which we would say, gosh, we were very respectful. Like, we would never, be rude to someone, right? You can disagree and say, actually, we think that's wrong, and here's why we think it is, and we share the same faith, and you can do that and maintain your Christian values. And it's okay to protest and sometimes be mad about it, right? Because the things that are happening right now in our country and our world, we believe, break God's heart. And I can't imagine he's, chilling, thinking about this stuff either. So that's another level of the pushback that, it's just something I think all of us in this work you'll hear people who have a different perspective on what it means to do that, and should we even be doing it.
Yeah.
So Lally, I'm just thinking, listening to this conversation, because the school I go to has a much higher level of suspension than some other schools, but we don't ever want to suspend anybody. It does no good whatsoever. Kid goes away for 5 days, hasn't learned anything, come back to school. Yep. Whatever was bothering him isn't taken care of. He's missed 5 days of school. And, but we're looking at the systemic thing where the state doesn't fund in-school suspension, does not pay the quality of people we need. The child is distressed so badly that he cannot function in the classroom that day. And we're dealing with this lack of effective dealing with concentrated distress, which we know is traumatically driven in our situation. So we're dealing with, I will say though, that talking the way I'm talking is making a bigger impact within places that have been traditionally less open. Mm-hmm. When we start saying, as our clergy did, and these were almost all Black Baptist clergy, how what kind of resources can we provide that would actually make a difference? And then can we advocate for those resources? It has changed the conversation with some of the wealthy suburban people who have participated in this horrible institutionalized discrimination that suburban, urban tax bases and schools have created. Yeah, Amy is nodding her head because she's living in the white flight suburb. I grew up in one, so I'm looking at it. And
yeah,
so
look,
a different conversation going by saying, okay, this makes a difference. These resources are needed. We can show you this makes a difference.
So Amy, let's pivot to you. And I'm guessing this might be sort of the life you're living these days, is exactly these issues. What kind of pushback do you get? And how do you, I mean, you've already said some about it, but how do you make the connections to the folks in your congregation between the biblical call for justice and this education equity work? And I know that you're working mostly in housing now, so if you want to focus on housing, we can do that translation.
Well, so, listening to Nicole and Ben, I can learn a lot about how to minister in a suburban context. I never lived in a suburb before, and there are particularities about Baltimore City and Baltimore County, but it's the same sort of pressures. Why do people leave the city? What does community mean in a context like the suburb? And Maryland is one of, as I'm sure you all know, one of the wealthiest states in the entire country. It has enormous disparity in terms of public education dollars for rural poverty, for urban poverty, and as the counties are impacted by that, there's a lot of defensiveness and anger, a lot of, I grew up in the city and now I live in the county and I'm doing for my kids better, kind of, but you know what, you can run, but you can't hide, right? I mean, it's the same issues. And I pray to be able to have some insight into how to do that. In the city, when we work together, we might disagree about what the work is, but about how to respond to the work. But we don't disagree about what the work is. In the county, there's much more of a sense of like isolation, a much more of a sense of like, I'm here for myself and my kids, and it's very hard to crack that open.
Well, one of the reasons that All Our Children focuses on helping congregations and their leaders establish these local partnerships with local schools is precisely because we first hypothesized, and now we are actually learning that it is the case, that when people come in close in that way and they develop these relationships, especially when these relationships are across differences of income and race and geography, it peels away some of those layers of defensiveness, because we get in close. And I know, Ben, you found this in your experience a lot in Richmond and with the diversity of congregations that are there as well. Even if it wasn't your own experience at that local school, yourself or your kids, you read to a first grader like once and you're in love with this kid, and it's like suddenly those policy issues that are affecting the kids, it's like it becomes really personal. And then questions about, well, wait a minute, what about redlining? And I know from our conference a number of years ago in Baltimore that Baltimore has an extraordinary history of neighborhood isolation and of covenants that excluded Black people from living in certain neighborhoods, and when you peel back that history, you can understand that that some of the neighborhoods that are now deeply impoverished were actually created that way by those with social power. But those conversations are very theoretical and abstract until you've got some relationships.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. All right.
The book, The Color of Law, which everybody should look at, which is
The Color of Law.
Best piece on institutional federal policy to create white owners and Black renters for the last 60 years. One of the reasons we're dealing with this incredible disparity in wealth. So it's really the best piece of work done on this housing thing
So I want to pivot us a little bit back to our own personal narratives here, and I'm going to invite, and Amy, let's start with you. Let's tell us a story about a time when you felt lost or kind of out of touch with your own spiritual grounding, and how you got it back.
How did I know that you were going to ask me that question?
It's happened to all of us, and we're here to share it. I talked about going for a walk. That's mine.
Yeah. So
you can pass. It's never share or die. One of our norms.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to pass and listen to Nicole and Ben.
Nicole, do you have a story you can share? You're comfortable sharing?
Sure.
Thank you.
So one of the things that's been happening, I feel like for several years for me, is like I had such an identity as initially kind of born again Christian, because the black folks don't typically use evangelical, but then just with a lot of the things I read when I did my dissertation in grad school were connected to evangelical tradition, and so that kind of it's like, oh yeah, this does make sense, and it really resonated for me. On a lot of levels. And then honestly, like the last, it's been a while, but the last few years in particular, it has been a very uncomfortable label for me, an uncomfortable identity. And I've had to really wrestle the last, so I don't sort of use it anymore because I feel like it just doesn't quite describe like how I think about my Christianity, mostly because of the negative connotation that comes along with it. But the last few years, looking at, to be perfectly blunt, my white brothers and sisters in the evangelical tradition has made me sort of so deeply question, like, like we say we have all of these principles in common, but yet we're making dramatically different choices. And some of them are, I mean, I'm obviously talking about political choices, but political is so personal, I think, for most of us. And it's when you're leading with your faith and saying your faith that we say we share causes you to do something that for me is literally hurtful and like bringing pain to my community and the Black community and the brown communities and immigrant communities. Like that has been something that I've really wrestled with, that I would love to say, Lally, there's a nice little bow to tie on the end of this story. I don't have one other than to say, I'm trying to do my best to listen when I find people that I feel like I can have a real conversation with, to understand like maybe some of the decisions they've made or beliefs they have. I may not agree, but to try to at least hear it, and for them to try to hear me, right? Like I'm trying to create more of that in my life. Not that I think my goal is to like make every like white evangelical, sort of think about race. Like I can't do that. That's exhausting. Like that's not my goal in life. But I do think it's such a crisis for me spiritually that it has taken me places with my faith where I'm like, yeah, maybe don't call me that label anymore. Like, I don't think I even want to have a 20% of me being called that label, but trying to figure out where to land with all of that. I may never come up with any kind of thing that makes me feel comfortable. But I guess the biggest thing, as I said, I'm trying to find places where I can at least understand, right? Or seek to understand, not to justify from my perspective, but at least to seek to understand. And there's something about that has been, there's grace there for me, and I think for others, when we've been able to have those very tough conversations, that I think does reflect the image of God, right? Like being able to extend grace to others. Yeah, it's probably an unsatisfying story, but it's probably
I think that's a beautiful story.
Relevant one for me right now.
No, it's a beautiful story. Thank you. Yeah, I think that we can be agents of healers in our own contexts, to the extent that we can find that kind of graciousness that you're describing, Nicole, inside ourselves, right? So it's like if we, for you to be seeking that generosity of spirit in yourself, can make things possible in the world around you. I mean, I think that's a beautiful story. So thank you. Ben, do you have a story to share?
Most of them I can't tell.
Okay. Do you have a story that you feel comfortable sharing that you can share?
Well, yesterday, next to a statue of Maggie Walker, who was the dramatic leader of the kind of separate city of African Americans that formed in Richmond from about 1840 on, and really was a separate community. And this was the great educator and leader of the African American community in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th. Right under that statue, or right next to it, the mayor and the governor and members of the city council and about 250 people gathered next to a bus rapid transit bus, which represents the development of a new transportation system for Richmond. As a result of this effort, which has been driven in the larger community, we have now extended our first major lines into the suburbs, which have been blocked for the last 50 years. And this movement, which I think it was the head of the Federal Transit Administration, at least for our region, who said yesterday that this movement really represents a determination that people will live together and be in the same place and get to know each other. 2 weeks ago, they asked me to speak to the Virginia Transit Association, and I wore my collar, Amy, and did a nice little preachment to these people about how they stood for the absolute essential nature of transportation for every single human being in this society. And that it was amazing. I mean, these people who just were laboring in this grim way, many of them, were elevated. I mean, really affected by this speech. It was interesting. So I feel like every time I'm able to move into a situation where in a secular context, we talk about what God really thinks is important. I find this incredible energy and wealth. It's non-denominational. It's not specifically Christian. It reminds me of Jesus with the woman at the Samaritan woman, where he says, the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship God in spirit and truth. When the spirit's right and the truth is being told, in this area of equity and human community, there is power. And, it raises me up. I mean, I'm still overwhelmed by what happened yesterday. We've been working for it for actually probably 50 years in this town since they segregated the transportation system, and people didn't have to ride on the back of the bus because no white people were on it. That's the way we did it here.
Well, thank you, Ben. And in a moment, Amy, I'm going to see if a question has come to your mind, and also to the folks who are listening. This is a good time if you have any questions for anyone on the panel to type them into the chat box. But Ben, I know that you've been working on this mass transit challenge for as long as I've known you, and of course, what you're doing is that you're connecting the people to where the jobs are. And if there's no way that the people can get to the jobs, then the people can't get jobs, and that can be part of the plan.
We don't even have public transportation to our community colleges.
For example, exactly. Yeah. In Atlanta, when the mass transit system was first being planned, this story was told to me secondhand by someone who's in the room when the comment was made, and but this is an example of structural racism. That's why I'm telling this story, that they didn't understand why they needed a subway stop at the airport, because the quotation was, Black people don't go to the airport and white people won't ride the subways. it doesn't get more blatant than that. So, Amy, do you have a story you want to share, or shall we roll on and see if our participants have any stories?
Roll on for the participants. Thank you.
All right. All right. Mary Liz, do we have any questions from our participants before we move into our wind up?
We do not. Nope.
All right. Then thank you, everybody, for being with us. As we turn towards our close, we value the feedback of everybody who's been with us for this really wonderful conversation. I first want to thank Ben and Nicole and Amy for being with us and for your thoughtfulness and your willingness to go to someplace so personal with us. In the chat box, Mary Liz has put a link to a brief 3-minute survey. Please fill it out for us. We read your responses and take them seriously. We are in a constant effort of getting better at what we're doing. And we also would love your typed answers to 2 simple questions. What worked well for you on this webinar? What would you like to celebrate and make sure that we stick with? And what would you suggest that we think about doing differently next time? We'd appreciate your answers to both of those questions. As I mentioned, the recording of this webinar is available on our Facebook page, and it will be posted onto our website. It's also the case that we're now taking a hiatus for this summer on our monthly webinars, but all of the webinars that we've done are available on our website. You can find links to them there. So if you've enjoyed this and want to see who else we've talked to about what other topics, I encourage you to head there. We'll be back in late August with our webinar schedule for the fall, and I want to particularly alert you all to a webinar that Nicole's organization is doing on Thursday. It's called Race and Equity, and they'll be talking about the ways that looking at the inherently unequal structures and systems, some of which we've been referring to this afternoon, that are still so evident and prevalent in public education. That's at 1 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. With Zakiya Jackson of the Expectations Project. Are there any other announcements for the good of the order that any of you all want to share with our participants, Ben or Nicole or Amy? No, great. Well, thanks everybody for being with us. It was great to have you. Have a wonderful summer, and I hope you'll be with us again starting in late August.